Hello, I'm Neil Whelan, and welcome to the Wesleyan Podcast. In this episode, brought to you by Wesleyan Financial Services, Laura Whyte talks to HR and employment solicitor Sarah Buxton about research carried out by Wesleyan about the financial concerns faced by female dentists. Before we get into that, though, I need to remind you this podcast is for information only and doesn't constitute advice. But if you do feel as if you need to talk to someone about your finances, I'll be back later to tell you how to get in touch with us. But for now, I'll hand you over to Sarah. And first up, Laura.
Recently at Wesleyan, we've undertaken our second set of research looking into the key financial concerns of female dentists. So as part of that research, we find that 2/3 of female dentists are planning to change how they work over the next 2 years. And then 71% of those have not fully planned for the financial impact. So I was just wondering from a legal perspective, how easy it is for dentists to implement changes and what do they need to consider?
Thank you for your question. It's really interesting, the report that Wesleyan has undertaken. It's really thrown out some interesting facts. And like you say, one of them is that within the next 2 years, the majority of female dentists are looking at changing their working pattern. And I think it's important that we distinguish between an employed associate and a self-employed associate. That's the first element that we need to look at. Because as an employed dentist, and you may think, oh, that's not relevant, there are not a lot of employed associates out there, but I am finding that more and more associates are wanting to be employed and that dental practices are offering employed positions. And the reason why some dentists want to be employed is so that they have the protection under the employment legislation. And one of the pieces of legislation that's applicable to employees and not self-employed staff is the right to request flexible working. And when I talk about flexible working, it's the right to change hours, days, or work from home. Obviously, working from home probably wouldn't work very well for a dentist because most patients have to be seen at the practice. But the other two, changing days and hours, an employed dentist has the statutory right to ask for that change. And it's quite difficult for the practice owner or employer to reject that change without going through a fair procedure. And they are therefore protected in terms of you cannot, you could make a claim against your employer if, for example, you were suffered a detriment or were dismissed because you'd asked for that request, and then the employer would have to pay you some compensation. So you're wholly protected as an employee. So it is, I suppose employees are in a position where it may be easier to think about changing hours at some point in the future because the law allows you to do that. And there's been some new proposals by the Labour government whereby they've said they are going to make it even easier for employees to make these requests. So I can't really comment on what that means at the moment because we're not quite sure ourselves, but it's going to be easier to make flexible working requests. So I think for employees, they are in a protected position, and for an employer to make changes to their working pattern, it's quite hard for an employer to do that without there being risk. And that's one of the benefits of being employed, that you have the security of employment. Now, if we look at that in contrast to self-employed associates, it's a completely different scenario because contractually, associates only have the security of whatever's in their agreement. And what I mean by that is that they only have the security of their notice period, for example. So if their notice period is 3 months, which tends to be industry standard, you're on a continually rolling 3-month notice period. And that goes for both parties. So that goes for the engager and the associate. They both have the ability to make changes as per the notice in the associate agreement. So I think where self-employed associates may think, well, I've got the ability to be able to make changes in the next 2 years. Bear in mind or always remember that so does the engager, so does the practice. So you really need to be prepared for the fact that this may come out of the blue. It might be a surprise that you're not expecting, and therefore you've got to be prepared financially, because legally they'll be allowed to do that. But what you then need to consider is how that's going to affect you personally, only ever having this 3 months security, if that's what your notice is. So although you have the flexibility to be able to change your hours, the risk is, by being self-employed, that the engager can also change the hours. So it's really important that there are provisions in place financially for you to make sure that you have that security in case that ever happens.
Really interesting. So what does that tend to look like as a scenario, if that's happened in the past with the associate at practice? Is it something that they can just suddenly reduce the associate's hours or increase them?
Yeah, so again, it will all go back to what's been agreed in the agreement at the outset. And what I find with associate agreements is that people sign them without truly understanding what's in there or taking advice on the obligations that's included, because whilst it's exciting getting a new job and the relationship's going swimmingly, you'll probably never refer to that agreement. But then when your hours get changed and you pull out the agreement because you're aggrieved by that, and actually there's a clause in that that says we can change your hours on a month's notice or 3 months, or I see things like we can change your UDA payments, for example, with only a month's notice. That is then, legally, they're allowed to do that. There's nothing you can do. They're not in breach of contract. There's no consequence of that. What we should have done is negotiated better clauses at the outset so that you had a longer period of time to then either look for other work or make sure that you've got a long period of time to get other sources for financial income, for example. But a month, for example, is not a long time if you've got a mortgage to pay and so on. So you really need to understand the obligations in the associate agreement and make sure that you have that security and that backup should that ever happen to you, because even if, for example, there was no obligation and they tried to force a change next week, and actually they were supposed to give you three months notice, but next week they've reduced your hours or your pay or whatever it may be. The last thing you really want to do is rely on the legal system, because it's incredibly expensive and at the moment incredibly time consuming to get to any outcome. So in that interim period, you need to be able to pay your mortgage, for example. You need to be able to continue to have financial provisions in place.
A hugely important point, and I think that's definitely going to be a theme running through the rest of the research findings as well, about really understanding your agreements with your practice.
Yeah.
So if we go on to the next point, 7 out of 10 female dentists are unsure how changes to how they work will impact their pension, and nearly 60% of female dentists believe they did not require more than £60,000 of annual retirement income.
Mm.
So it's quite linked to the first question, but what's the standard obligations for practices? Is it easy for dentists to exit the profession? And what are the practices flexible in doing that?
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to understanding your employment status and understanding your contract. So when we talk about retirement, lots of people don't realise that for employed associates, employed members of the team, the to retire somebody and the employer retiring them, that was retracted from legislation a long time ago. So you can't force somebody to retire. And I think for employees, it's really sad situation to be in, because, I remember when people used to employers would retire people and you'd have a retirement party, for example, and everybody would wish them the best. But now that's not a fair reason to dismiss somebody. Also, in that situation, that you were given notice of being retired, of retirement, so it gave you time to plan. And I think employees take for granted that they have probably most practices provide just a general auto-enrolment pension scheme. And they think that they've been employed, they've paid in, it will probably do. But even as an employee, you need to take independent financial advice, because what's been paid into an auto-enrolment scheme may not be enough to keep up with your lifestyle or what you wish to retire on. But it's very difficult for an employer to retire an employee. It's usually nowadays an employee who says, I'm looking to retire now. And of course, when they look to retire and they're handing in their notice, hopefully they will have taken advice on to whether they're in a position financially where they can, because the employer would not get involved in that. For self-employed staff, I think, in my opinion, I think self-employed tend to be more aware of pension contributions and what they're paying in, especially if they have an NHS pension, because I think they're aware that everybody says, oh, the NHS pension's really good. So that is something that I think self-employed staff are more aware of. But I think what they fail to do is truly understand the contributions and whether that is enough. I think they look at their contract and they make sure that that's a deduction that's been made on their behalf. They'll see it on their monthly schedules, but whether they look into it enough, I don't think is always done. And like the stats show, it's not always done. And again, you need to make sure that the contract fits with the advice, that the deductions that are being made and so on are enough. And as a lawyer, we wouldn't get involved in what those deductions are or if they're enough. We'll tell you that there's a deduction being made, or if there's anything in the contract that could affect those pension contributions. But we don't provide financial advice where we can say, oh, you're at a point now where you can retire, or you're going to have the lifestyle that you require. And I think, again, sometimes it's just taken for granted. And I think that's really why, in conjunction with understanding your associate agreement, you do need to take independent financial advice to make sure that your goals, if you've even thought about it, I think that's the point. Some people don't even think about it, that you will be at a point. And I think every time there's a change in your hours or days or remuneration, you need to go back and make sure that that pension pot's still being filled, or make sure that you are still at a point where your goals will be reached for retirement. And I think people fail to do that. And we've already said it's not just you as an associate who can make those changes. It's the engager as well who can make those changes. So every time that happens, I would say make sure that you take independent financial legal advice on the effects that's going to have on your retirement.
There's some really good points there for dentists to consider. We find in the research that female dentists now primarily rely on the advice of their partner or spouse when it comes to making financial decisions. And that's actually increased by 11% from our previous research. And it's now overtaken dentists that are self-advising through research or taking financial advice from the financial advisor and expert in their field. In fact, it's only 3 out of 10 female dentists that would actually seek advice from a financial expert. What are your thoughts from a legal standpoint on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting stat, and I think, in my opinion, I think people are quite worried to pick up the phone. And I think it's a confidence issue. I think even taking legal advice, people will prefer to send you a message on social media or contact you by email rather than having the confidence to pick up the phone to another professional. And I think it's easier to maybe take advice from a partner or close family friend because you're seeing them and you have huge trust in them. It almost reminds me of the people that take advice from the social media groups, and you think to yourself, well, nobody knows or understands the full instructions. I've seen lots of reckless and negligence advice put out there in these chats because they're not professionals. But I do also understand that for some people, that's the easiest way for them to communicate and they get an answer. But the issue is the answer might not be also correct. And it's the same with your partner or family friends. You know, they may have a little bit of knowledge, but not truly understand or asking the right questions. And I think in this industry especially, it's so important you take advice from people that understand dentists. They understand how the dental industry works, because there's so many special elements to being a dental associate or practice owner that we need to fully understand. And I'm not sure that your partner, for example, would understand the workings of an NHS contract and how that works with superannuation, unless they are a financial advisor. But even then, you'd go to the extent of saying, well, are you a financial advisor that specialises in dentistry, like we do with lawyers? You know, you don't have to explain UDAs, superannuation, self-employed status. That's all second nature to us and will always act in your best interest. But I think especially women who maybe have taken time out of their role, and I think maybe for numerous reasons, but let's take the maternity scenario. You know, they might be out of a situation, out of being in a professional practice for maybe a year, up to a year. And then it's about confidence and having your confidence growing and getting that back. And I hope, and I think just like Wesleyan, we try and say, as much as possible, you know, we're all human. It's okay. Give us a ring. We'll help you through. Or if you want to communicate by email, that's also okay. Let's do it via that method and have relationships with people so we get to know you, and try not to be daunting, because I do appreciate that contacting professionals can be a daunting situation. But I think the message for women to take out of this is, although you may trust your partner or family members, they may not be the best people to be asking advice from. You can get their opinion, but you can take that along with making sure that you've taken some professional advice, because we will have liability for that advice and you'll know that it's the correct thing to do.
makes complete sense. And I'm quite interested, I'm going to pop you on the spot a little bit.
Okay.
You mentioned here about what you see on Facebook groups where people are asking for advice and that you see cases of negligence. Do you have any examples of what that looks like? What sort of things you've kind of seen where that happens?
Yeah, I mean, quite often it will be, so for example, I saw one on a group whereby somebody was saying, oh, can somebody help me with the holiday entitlement calculations for an employee? And then somebody said, yes, I can help. This is what they're supposed to have and how it's worked out. And they'd taken a screenshot from a website, and it was from somewhere in Australia. And obviously that's completely different jurisdiction, completely different legislation in place. And it was wrong. It was plain wrong. And you don't know if that person's gone and acted on that. And then if they do, they're in risk of an employment tribunal claim against them. And that always sticks in my mind as one, because it is complete negligence there. But yeah, it's quite often the case that there's a lot of people who have a little bit of knowledge, but not the full extent. And quite often you can't give advice on the social media groups because they only tell you a small amount of the information you need to know. And that's the difficulty. You don't know the full story. So you'll see things where, for example, they'll say, oh, I've got an employee and they're underperforming. What shall I do? And somebody will say, well, if they're not right, you should dismiss them. Well, there's so much more to it than that. You need to ask how long their service is, if they've got any medical issues they're aware of, and so on. So, yeah, it's really difficult. And I do understand why people may default to those groups. And I think the pandemic has got a lot to do with it, as in people were all over social media looking for the answers to a lot of questions. But it's a dangerous place to be.
Just to wrap everything up, are there any other thoughts around research or things to consider from a legal perspective that you think it's important for female dentists to be aware of?
Yeah, I think for females, I think I do, I'm in the legal profession myself. I do understand that it can be difficult in terms of quite often you'll come out of practice for, like we've already said, for maybe a year's maternity. I think we look at things like, as we're getting older, if you look at menopause, for example, and the effects that can have on females in the workplace, it can really knock your confidence or have an effect on how you feel from a well-being perspective. And I think that then has a huge effect on people feeling confident to take legal or financial advice. And what I would say is, it's just the first step, just to reach out, and it's probably not as daunting as it may seem at the outset. And everybody, for example, here would be communicate with in the manner that they feel as though they want to be communicated with. So, for example, if you really don't want to get on the phone, email is an option, and so on. So I think there's lots of options, but I do think that if you do have the confidence and it grows, then you should take advice from a professional. I would never ever diagnose that my own teeth, that I need a filling. I'd always go to a professional, to my local dentist, to make sure if that was the case. And I think you've got to think about it in the same way for financial and legal advice. Use the professionals; they're there to support you and help you.
Really good advice, and I think there's a lot of really useful information that you provided there. And thank you so much for your time on this week's podcast. we would absolutely love to have you back on in future with any other legal nuggets that you can provide us.
Thank you.
I think people will find them really useful.
And that's our show for this week. Thank you to Laura and Sarah. If you are looking for expert financial advice, go to wesleyan.co.uk, where you can book an appointment with one of our specialist financial advisors. Charges may apply, but we won't charge you until you've agreed the services you require and the associated costs. Find out more at wesleyan.co.uk/charges. If you want to find out about Wesleyan more generally, you can find us on the website formerly known as Twitter, over on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. And if you found the podcast useful, you can like and subscribe to us on all the usual platforms, as well as find us on YouTube, where there's a whole library of videos covering a wide range of financial planning topics. But that's it for now. So until next time, thanks for listening.